Hello and welcome to the Brothers' War. Previously, we covered the initial reactions to the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the caning of Charles Sumner, and the very opening stages of Bleeding Kansas. Today, we will cover the full extent of that wound and that conflict. On April 23, 1856, a gunman, who remains unknown to this day, shot and wounded the sheriff of Lawrence, Kansas, while he was out arresting Free Staters for contempt of the court. The pro-slavery kangaroo court, just so you know. Despite public condemnation of the shooting by citizens and government of Lawrence, this was too much for the pro-slavery forces in the state. It was the only story covered in the various pro-slavery newspapers and pamphlets that were in circulation in Missouri and Kansas and across the South, who were openly calling for retaliatory violence against these abolitionist murderers, even though the sheriff would live and the shooter was anonymous. But it worked. All across the South, not just in Missouri, the rabid pro-slavery forces assembled under banners that literally said, and I quote, "For the supremacy of the white race," among many other things that do not bear repeating. They passed near John Brown's home on their way to Lawrence, and Brown would immediately busy himself cleaning rifles and sharpening his broadswords. On the 8th of May, the pro-slavery government charged the Topeka government with high treason and specified the Free State Hotel in Lawrence as a headquarters of abolitionist sedition. On the 21st of May, the day before the caning of Charles Sumner, after entering the town of Lawrence, U.S. Senator David Atchison hyped up his horde with the following words. "Boys, this day we have entered Lawrence with Southern rights inscribed upon our banner, and not one damn abolitionist dared to fire a gun. Now, boys, this is the happiest day of my life. We have entered that damn town and taught the damn abolitionists a Southern lesson that they will remember until the day they die. And now, boys, we will go in again and test the strength of that damn Free State Hotel and teach the Immigrant Aid Society that Kansas shall be ours. Boys, the ladies of Lawrence should, and I hope will, be respected by every gentleman. But when a woman takes upon herself the garb of a soldier by carrying a rifle, then she is no longer worthy of our respect. Trample her under your feet as you would a snake. If one man or woman dare stand before you, blow them to hell with a cold chunk of lead." His men then charged the town, stormed the printing presses of the Free State and the Herald of Freedom, and ransacked the Free State Hotel. Training a cannon on the hotel while the panicked occupants fled, after it was abandoned, some 30 cannon shots were fired into the building. Satisfied with the destruction, the border ruffians, thoroughly inebriated on both rage and liquor, looted and plundered the town. Miraculously, in this whole affair, only one person had died, a ruffian struck in the head by debris from the cannonading of the hotel. Free State reactions to this were twofold. Most, in the face of this overwhelming force, were ready to call it quits, and broke camp to return to Ohio and Illinois and New England. But many now thought it was clear that the liberation of Kansas would not come through legal means. It was now a war to the knife. John Brown and his small army of sons were solidly in the second camp. Sarah Robinson, a free soiler whose husband was captured by pro-slavery force, notes, "So now the slave power, bloodthirsty and still crying for more victims, has sent its own tools, ragged, ignorant, debauched semi-savages, the very offshoot and growth of its peculiar institution, to destroy a quiet town, to steal, destroy, and outrage its inhabitants. The work has been accomplished. The first time in history of the American people has an American town been besieged and its inhabitants robbed by forces acting under the instructions of U.S. officers." John Brown was not much for speeches, and upon hearing the simultaneous news of the caning of Sumner a few days prior and the fall of Lawrence, he assembled his sons and the Pottawatomie rifles and said, "We are going down to make an example. Are you coming with us? Something must be done to show these barbarians that we too have rights." He set out a call for volunteers to join him. Brown, some of his sons, and some of the rifles, a party of 8 in all, took up arms, razor-sharp broadswords to be specific, and boarded a wagon headed for Osawatomie, aiming to settle the score. Brown and company went marauding through the countryside, hacking 5 pro-slavery settlers to death, but only after receiving answers to the affirmative in interrogation that they were involved in the attack at Lawrence. Kansas was now bleeding. Troops were dispatched from Forts Riley and Leavenworth to alleviate the conflict, but pro- and anti-slavery guerrillas now circled each other anxiously, weapons in hand. The Rubicon had been crossed and fire was now being stoked. The pro-slavery newspaper Herald declared, "The abolitionists shoot down our men without provocation wherever they meet them. Let us retaliate in the same manner. A free fight is all we desire. If murder and assassination is the program of the day, we are in favor of filling the bill. Let not the knives of pro-slavery men be sheathed while there is one abolitionist in the territory." Warrants were issued for the arrest of John Brown and his band, and deputy marshals, angry pro-slavery mob in tow, set out to catch him. On June the 2nd, a detachment of this mob, under the command of Henry Pate, was encamped near Prairie City. While attending church, they were recognized by the anti-slavery fighters sympathetic to Brown named Captain Shore, who told Brown that they were in a place called Black Jack. Brown and Shore organized a band of 26, 9 under Brown and 15 under Shore, to drive them off. Approaching the camp by the hills above it, they were spotted and immediately came under small arms fire. Charging downhill, Brown aimed to drive the men away, but about half of his 26 men had just booked it and ran out of there, leaving only a few with Brown, and he ordered them to go to ground while Shore left to find reinforcements. Only Brown and his small band were left, loading and firing into the ruffians. After a few minutes, Pate approached Brown and the few volunteers he had left, and, not recognizing Brown, announced that he was under orders from the federal government to arrest the murderers of the pro-slavery men. Brown immediately knew this was him and ordered Pate to surrender. When Pate protested, Brown drew his revolver and demanded that he surrender. Pate would later say, "Had I known who I was fighting, I would not have trusted to a white flag." Hostage in tow, Brown approached the ruffians and demanded they lay down arms and follow him, and they immediately busied themselves in doing so. Brown had won. He took them back to camp and negotiated their release on the condition of the release of any hostages taken in Lawrence. After narrowly avoiding arrest at the hands of U.S. troops and an angry mob, Brown ordered his men to disappear, and Brown and Sons vanished off the map. At this point, in Lawrence, various representatives of the Free State government and partisan groups got together in late July to settle on a strategy. Although they were ostensibly winning Bleeding Kansas so far, they had yet to win a decisive once-and-for-all victory and gain the recognition from the federal government as a free state. They concluded they needed help from the North. And the North was willing to provide. The New England Emigrant Aid Society raised funds and shipped $4,000 worth of the very modern Sharps rifle, and other abolitionists went on speaking tours all across the North, raising funds, purchasing guns, and sending volunteers. They raised an Army of the North, about 400 strong, with officers in uniforms, and after raiding the Iowa City government arsenal, modern rifles, and cannon. Upon hearing this very illegal, if not treasonous action, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, yes, that Jefferson Davis, gave Colonel Edwin Sumner orders to disband the Topeka Congress and made this news very public while doing so. This brought Brown out of hiding, and his band joined the Free State militia assembling for a showdown. However, the federal forces vastly outnumbered the defenders, and the Topeka Congress was dissolved without incident. The Army of the North is en route while this is all happening, and only then joined up with the existing anti-slavery forces in Nebraska City in early August to discuss strategy. And they decided that the existing Lawrence militia, under the command of Lane, should launch attacks against nearby pro-slavery outposts and then quickly return to Lawrence and invite retaliatory ruffians who would subsequently be crushed by the Army of the North. Brown, for reasons unknown to this day, but possibly trying to ransom one of his captive sons, would not be involved in any way. After dark on August 12th, the Lawrence militia attacked Fort Franklin. They surrounded the outpost and let out a volley of fire that drove the 14 ruffians defending it indoors. They would spend the entire night taking pot shots at each other to little effect. Getting bored, some militiamen would sneak over the wall and set fire to the building, and this drove the ruffians out. Only one man from the Lawrence militia would die in this affair. The Lawrence militia, now 500 men strong, followed the Washington Creek down to Fort Saunders. Now, calling these installations forts is pretty generous. They're mostly one-room, dirt-floor log cabins with some earth and timber breastworks placed around them, and Fort Saunders was no different. Brown's band joined up now and made a show parading around the fort by kicking up dust with wagons, seeking to induce a surrender by means of appearing to have even more men than they actually had. The anti-slavery forces charged and scaled the breastworks and bashed down the door to find Fort Saunders completely abandoned. The show of force had worked, and they gathered significant amounts of rifles, powder, and uncast lead. Torching the fort, the militia set off for Lecompton, the territorial capital. When pro-slavery man Henry Titus attempted to lead a patrol and catch the Lawrence militia by surprise, he was wandering essentially blind through the prairie and stumbled on the militia by accident. Neither side having any idea of the numbers of the other, there was a brief clash and Titus's men fled, with a small detachment, 50-ish, of the Lawrence militia commanded by Samuel Walker in pursuit. Arriving at Titus's homestead, Walker's men charged downhill, chasing the Southerners who holed up in the cabin. Walker's group then made a rough line around the cabin and began firing into it with a rifle and those cannons from the Army of the North. The loud report of the cannon alerted a nearby Federal Army contingent, who, mistaking it as coming from nearby Lecompton, marched off to head off the militia heading towards the town. Roughly as the Feds are leaving camp, Titus surrenders after being heavily wounded. The Lawrence men looted and torched his home and departed back for Lawrence. Having thoroughly kicked the hornet's nest, the Southern, pro-slavery, and ruffian newspapers went to town with all this news, painting pictures of abolitionists marauding through the countryside, murdering at will. And new lodges and militias were assembling in Missouri and Texas to cross over into Kansas to participate in the bloodshed. Their target? Osawatomie. Their objective? Retaliation. On August 22nd, John Brown assembled a band in Lawrence, intending to act a plan of his he had been working on for some time. They joined up with the Lawrence militia, who were heading towards Osawatomie because they'd been tipped off that Osawatomie was the target of the Missouri column. They were passing burned homesteads and dead horses along the road, evidence of the violence that had been set loose on Kansas. They arrived at Osawatomie and found it completely deserted. Holding a council of war 3 days later, Brown and the other captains made a plan. Brown was of the belief that natural defenses were superior to man-made ones, and argued that the first line of defense should be placed at Marais de Signy, and then a second in the outskirts of the town, and that in general the Free Staters should just adopt a defensive posture. However, he was voted down by the other captains, who argued they should instead go on the offensive. Seeing as the town was abandoned, there was no strategic value in defending it. Brown departed the war meeting and left Osawatomie without a word. He decided to go cattle raiding and terrorizing various slave owners, and so he was oblivious to what happens next. The Northerners ambushed the Missouri column on the morning of August 26th. Shots were fired and the Northerners pushed forward in an unorganized mob and caught the ruffians unbalanced, firing into the column. The Southerners had no time for orders, they turned and fled, leaving behind all their horses, wagons, ammunition, powder, supplies, and many of their guns. Brown heard the news and caught up with the encamped Northerners the following day, and met up with them as they lay encamped upon the spoils of battle. Asking if there were any ruffians left for him, he was told that the ruffians had raided Pottawatomie and were out plundering somewhere in that area. Taking a band of 25 men, John Brown went out in hot pursuit, riding through the night and passing the very same cabins where he and his sons had put their broadswords to use just a few months earlier. Getting lost in the woods, Brown narrowly avoided a friendly fire incident when he mistook the northern camp for ruffians. He would go on raiding various pro-slavery settlements and return to Osawatomie on August 29th. Hearing of this abject and total failure to keep the peace, President Pierce would fire the territorial governor of Kansas and replace him with the sturdy, competent, and capable John W. Geary. But until Geary could arrive, the position of governor would be filled by the rabid, pro-slavery Daniel Woodson, who had only one objective in mind: crush the abolitionists and end the Northern aggression. He declared that the Lawrence militia were an insurrection. This was exactly the retaliation that the Missourians were looking for, and they instantly raised a second Missouri column, almost 500 strong, to Kansas. Hearing the news of another Missouri column, the Free Staters in Lawrence summoned back the Lawrence militia and all other anti-slavery bands to defend it. Brown's band, however, would remain behind in Osawatomie in a delaying action to buy as much time to defend Lawrence and set up fortifications. He managed to stop the Missouri column with a band of maybe 20 men and stopped their charge into the town. He concealed his positions in the nearby woods. Even under canister and grape shot, Brown refused to retreat from his numerically superior foe, outnumbered maybe 10-1, until he was shot in the back. He was not seriously wounded and would later claim that God had saved his life. After this, Brown was forced to pull back and the Missourians entered Osawatomie and burned it to the ground. Brown was recorded watching the smoke billow up from a nearby hill and said, "I have only a short time to live, only one death to die, and I will die fighting for this cause. There will be no more peace in this land until slavery is done for. I will carry this war into Africa." The Missouri column passed into Leavenworth and drove out the Free State settlers there, burning and looting as they went, while John Brown and his band stalked them quietly in the woods, reporting their locations to Lawrence and Topeka, acting as guides for other partisan forces who retaliated on all fronts. But they could not stop the column, who were in Franklin, aiming to sack Lawrence just 2 days away. Bleeding Kansas was now arterial. Enter, finally, Governor Geary. On September 9th, after arriving at Lecompton, he issued the following public statement. Men of the North, men of the South, of the East and of the West in Kansas, will you not end this fratricidal strife? Will you not cease to regard each other as enemies, and look upon one another as children of a common mother, and come and reason together? Promising to staunch the bleeding, he lambasted both sides of the conflict, and committed himself to being an impartial third party. He disbanded the pro-slavery territorial militia and called for a new one, drawing from both sides. He also set loose all prisoners taken over the course of the conflict. He made it very clear that the real legitimate force in Kansas was him and the U.S. Federal Army. This carrot-and-stick approach would garner very impressive results. He brokered a deal with the citizens of Lawrence, saying that he would protect them from the ruffians if they supported him and if they disbanded the Lawrence militia and the Army of the North. He made a full acknowledgement that the pro-slavery laws were stacked against them, and he said he would prove his support with them in the legal battle to change those laws or write a new constitution. He brought in federal troops to simultaneously arrest Free State partisans and turn back the Missouri column, 3,000 strong. He then rode into Lawrence, and after assuring their safety personally, he rode to Franklin and warned the ruffian leaders that if they tries to raise another Missouri column and tried attacking Lawrence yet again, well, that would just cause a huge anti-slavery backlash across the United States. Election day is in a month. Less than a month. And Buchanan, the Democrat, had to repeat the Republican Fremont of the slavery movement just to survive at all. By the time Election Day rolled around, tempers had almost completely diminished, and Bleeding Kansas finally received her sorely needed bandage. Bleeding Kansas had claimed almost 200 lives and cost $2 million in 1856 dollars in property damage. The fire of Kansas had been reduced to smoldering embers. Speaking of elections, it is now November 3rd, and the presidency, the House, and a third of the Senate are about to be decided. The 1856 elections kind of serve as a referendum on Bleeding Kansas and the slavery question in general. It's at this point that the Whigs finally do implode, with most of their membership going into the Know-Nothings. The Democrat Buchanan swept the South, winning 174 electoral votes and managed to split the North, because the Republicans got a little ahead of themselves and nominated an abolitionist, John Fremont. While they won an impressive 114 electoral votes, Fremont was unable to defeat Buchanan. The Know-Nothings nominated Millard Fillmore, and he only managed to win one state, Maryland, and so the Know-Nothings are now very, very unstable. In the House, the Anti-Nebraska Party and the People's Party consolidated with the Republicans, who increased from 45 seats to 90, but the Know-Nothings performed quite poorly, going from 37 seats to 14, and the Democrats increased their majority from 81 to a comfortable 132. However, in the Senate, the Democrats lost 3 seats and the Republicans gained 3. The Democrats won a trifecta, and the referendum on Kansas and slavery had resoundingly declared, slavery is bad, but abolitionism is not the answer. Who won Bleeding Kansas? Well, it's kind of hard to say, because the conflict had definitely not gone how the Southerners had wanted, but it had also not gone how the Northerners had wanted. The pro-slavery camp nationwide had won big in the elections, and the very slavery-friendly Democrats held a trifecta. Admission to the Union with slavery seemed to be the outcome of the conflict. But Kansas isn't a state yet. It's still technically up in the air. And Bleeding Kansas, as we know it, did not straight up end in the fall of 1856. There would be occasional raids, murders, mobs, and arson until its eventual admission to the Union. But abolitionists across the country really had suffered a setback, both from the seeming loss of Kansas to slavery and the definite loss of an abolitionist in the presidential race. Abolitionism, it seemed, would never really exert any force on mainstream politics. Your friendly neighborhood abolitionist, John Brown, would continue in various abolitionist ventures for 3 more years. And although he would never take the fight to Africa, he would roam and ramble with a small army of sons in tow, raising money and acquiring weapons where he could. He became heavily involved in the Underground Railroad and launched several raids to free slaves in Missouri and smuggle them all the way into Canada. After doing this for some time, Brown hatched a plan. A big plan. Bigger than Kansas. He knew, by now, that a band of 10 to 50 men could only accomplish limited objectives, and looking at Europe, he knew he had to start a revolution if he wanted to get anything done. He took to studying the revolutions of 1848, Garibaldi in particular, and the Haitian Revolution, and started seeking to cause one of his own. The target would be the great slave power, the Devil's Home itself, Virginia. specifically the government rifle factory and major arsenal at Harpers Ferry, where he would proceed to arm and equip a full-blown slave revolution. Absolutely convinced of his divine destiny and ultimate triumph, he cut off the bridges at Harpers Ferry with a band of 19 men, both black and white, on October 16, 1859. They overwhelmed the night watchman at the arsenal, and Brown declared, "I came here from Kansas, and this is a slave state. I want to free all the Negroes in this state. I have possession now of the United States Armory, and if the citizens interfere with me, I must only burn the town and have blood." He then captured the rifle factory, and so far, everything is going exactly according to plan. But the tocsin bells are sounding across Virginia and Maryland, and impromptu militias and state forces are gathering from across both states to drive out Brown's raiders, who held out through the night and into the 17th. As the shooting started and Brown's comrades fell around him in the night, he held on to the hope that the slaves were breaking their chains, and that they were streaming to him, and that help was coming. But nobody came. A detachment of U.S. Marines and a cavalry squadron commanded by Jeb Stuart was sent to Harper's Ferry to recapture it. In command of this hastily assembled force was Colonel Robert E. Lee. Yes, that Robert E. Lee. While Lee was en route, the militia bum-rushed Harper's Ferry, forcing Brown and his raiders into the nearby armory building. As the Marines cornered the armory, they found that Brown had escaped into the nearby fire engine house. He slipped a note under the door asking to negotiate a surrender. The bloodthirsty militia shredded his note and put the building under siege. On the morning of the 18th, Lee, Stuart, and the Marines had arrived. With bayonets fixed, the regulars battered the doors with sledgehammers. Brown knew this was the end, but a militiaman would later recall, viewing Brown through a window, he was the coolest and firmest man I ever saw. With one son dead by his side and another shot through, he felt the pulse of his dying son with one hand and held his rifle with the other, and commanded his men with the utmost composure, encouraging them to sell their lives as dearly as he could. While the Marines surrounded the building, Jeb Stuart approached under a flag of truce. He passed to Brown a note written by Lee commanding Brown to give an unconditional surrender, with assurances he would not be given to the mob and would face a proper, impartial trial. Brown gave the note back to Stuart and said that he would only surrender if his men were allowed to escape. Stuart refused. The commander stood back and the cavalry troopers battered down the doors with a ladder. The doors burst and the Marines stormed the building, killing most of Brown's men and knocking him unconscious. Brown's revolution lasted only 36 hours. John Brown was tried on the charge of treason against Virginia on October 25th. The pre-trial was short, mostly because of the lynch mob out for Brown's blood trying to break down the courthouse doors. Brown's lawyers pled not guilty, and the trial proper was held 2 days later. Brown was tried while laying down on a cot as he was too injured to stand. At first, Brown's lawyers went off script and tried to go for a plea of insanity in an obvious last-ditch attempt to save John's life. Brown wouldn't stand for it, and insisted on his sanity, positing that he was one of the few sane men in the country and demanded a new lawyer. The fed-up judge dismissed both this demand and the insanity plea. Although Brown never denied his role in the raid, his legal counsel pointed out that there was no way Brown was guilty of treason against Virginia, saying, truthfully, both that Brown was not a citizen of Virginia, nor even a resident there, and that since he failed to incite the revolution he so desired, he had in reality not even posed a significant threat to Virginia. To use modern parlance, it was basically a mob action in practice, an Occupy movement gone crazy. Attempted revolution is not on the books as a crime, after all, but the trial was also short. John Brown was found guilty as charged 45 minutes after the trial began. On November 2nd at the sentencing, just before the sentence itself was passed, Brown was asked if there was any reason the sentence of execution should not be given to him. He then gave a short oration, completely without notes, which I will repeat here in full. In the first place, I deny everything but what I have admitted all along, the design on my part to free the slaves. I intended certainly to have made a clean thing of that matter, as I did last winter when I went into Missouri and there took slaves without the snapping of a gun on either side, moving them through the country and finally left them in Canada. I designed to have done the same thing again on a larger scale. That was all I intended. I never did intend murder, or treason, or the destruction of property, or to excite or incite slaves to rebellion, or to make insurrection. I have another objection, and that is, it is unjust that I should suffer such a penalty. Had I interfered in the manner which I admit, and which I admit has been fairly proved, for I admire the truthfulness and candor of the greater portion of the witnesses who have testified in this case, had I so interfered in behalf of the rich, the powerful, the intelligent, the so-called great, or in behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, brother, sister, wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have done in this interference, it would have been all right, and every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than punishment. This court acknowledges, I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament. That teaches me that all things whatsoever that men should do unto me, I should do even so unto them. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds, as bound with them. I endeavored to act up to that instruction. I say, I am yet too young to understand that God is any respecter of persons. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by the wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit. Let it be done. Let me say one word further. I feel entirely satisfied with the treatment I have received on my trial. Considering the circumstances and animosity towards me, it has been fair and more generous than I expected, but I feel no consciousness of guilt. I have stated from the very first what my intention was and what it was not. I had never had any design against the life of any person, nor any disposition to commit treason, or excite slaves to rebel, or make any kind of general insurrection. I never encouraged any man to do so, but always discouraged any idea of that kind. Let me say also a word in regard to the statements made by some of those connected with me. I hear it has been stated by some of them that I have induced them to join me, but the contrary is true. I do not say this to injure them, but as regretting their weakness. There is not one of them that joined me of his own accord, and the greater part of them at their own expense. A number of them I never saw, I never had a word of conversation with, till the day they came to me, and that was for the purpose I have stated. Now, if you're paying attention here, you'll notice Brown is not telling the truth. He's engaging in revisionism when he states that he had no intention to start a revolution. He clearly did. The reasons for this self-redaction kind of remain a mystery, but I believe that he was trying to play both sides. He was hoping that, if possible, he could avoid a sentence of death and maybe try again, or finally go to Africa. But if he was executed, and he probably would be, he had to make his motivations and condemnation of the United States known one last time. Either way, his very last plea was that his co-conspirators go free. John Brown was sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead, with the execution to be held on December 2nd, as soon as was legally possible. May God have mercy on his soul. Brown was awoken early in the morning of, and he passed a note to his jailer. We'll get to that later. He was escorted from the Charlestown jail an hour before his execution, and using his coffin as a chair, he rode into town to meet the God he fought over. Seeing the Blue Ridge Mountains around him, he said, "This is a beautiful country. I never had the pleasure of seeing it before." I'm going to describe his execution next, and it was a botched execution, so for the squeamish among you, jump to the timestamp that's showing up on your screen right now. He ascended the gallows without a fuss, completely calm and firm at all times. He was hooded, and the noose was placed around his neck, and 10 long minutes passed. Brown stood completely stoic and calm while all the officials took their places. The rope holding the trapdoor supporting him was cut, and Brown fell. The noose failed to break his sinewy neck, and with an almost animal strength and through sheer force of will, Brown struggled at the end of his rope for nearly 15 minutes as he was asphyxiated. He was buried with the noose around his neck. He'd gone to be a soldier in the army of the Lord. Thanks for watching. If you liked it, give it a like. If you didn't, a dislike. In the comments, you can leave suggestions for special episodes, questions for the Q&A, and whatever else you'd like to put there. Please be sure to share this video with the history buff in your life, and now it's time to get to that note that Brown passed to his jailer. It read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood. I had, I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done.